The restaurant glowed with polished marble and soft velvet curtains that framed the golden lights. The chandeliers dripped crystals, scattering light like diamonds across white linen tables. Every corner hummed with a quiet chatter of wealth, the sound of forks clinking against porcelain plates imported from Italy, the subdued laughter of men who believed the world bent in their favor. At the center of it all sat a man whose presence demanded attention. He was not the richest in the city, but in this room, he carried himself as if he were. His gold watch gleamed louder than his voice, catching the glow of every candle that flickered across the table. He leaned back in his chair with a confidence that was less about who he was and more about who he believed others were not. The black waitress approached, her steps light but certain, her tray balanced steady despite the pressure of so many eyes that never really saw her. To most, she was invisible, moving between tables like a shadow, her name rarely remembered, her smile often mistaken as part of the uniform. But tonight, something unexpected was about to break that silence. She leaned in, listening carefully as the man ordered his meal. He raised his glass, smirking, waiting for the wine he had already decided would not be poured fast enough. And then it happened. Softly, almost like a whisper meant only for herself, she spoke under her breath. The words that left her lips were not English. They were not French. They were Latin. The ancient syllables rolled from her tongue with a fluency that did not belong to chance. They flowed like music from another age, each word wrapping around the room with a strange, haunting beauty. For a fleeting moment, the air shifted. The murmur of conversations died down. The sound of a knife-cutting steak paused mid-motion. Heads tilted, eyes flicked in her direction, as though something sacred had been released into the atmosphere. A waitress speaking the language of scholars, the language of priests, the language carved into stone centuries before these men had inherited their fortunes. And then, like a match striking against silence, the man laughed. It wasn't the laugh of surprise, not the laugh of someone charmed or intrigued. No. It was sharp, mocking, heavy with the weight of ridicule. It tore through the quiet like broken glass. "Latin," he sneered, his voice carrying, loud enough to make sure everyone heard. "Latin. From her." His words dripped with disbelief, but worse than that, with contempt. To him, her tongue had overstepped its boundary. A waitress was supposed to serve, not speak like a scholar. The moment was not for her to own, and so he snatched it back with cruelty disguised as humor. The laughter spread from his mouth, bouncing off the marble walls, echoing in corners where silence once lived. The sound was infectious, not because anyone else found it funny, but because in rooms like this, power decided what was worth laughing at. A few chuckled, nervously, unsure if they were laughing at the joke or at the man himself. Others lowered their eyes, unwilling to be caught watching. And in that space between pride and shame, the waitress stood frozen. Her eyes did not flinch, though her hands trembled just slightly at her sides. The tray she carried wavered for only a second before she steadied it, pressing her lips together, swallowing words she knew she could not afford to release. She had been here before, not in this exact moment, but in moments that rhymed with it, when her intelligence was mocked, when her presence was belittled, when her dignity was tested. And still, she had learned to hold her ground. But standing in front of him now, the sting of his laughter was undeniable. It burned against her skin, searing her like a flame she couldn't escape. No one defended her. No one spoke. The silence of the room was worse than the cruelty of the laugh. It told her what she already knew, that in this place, her worth began and ended with the plates she carried. She was not meant to be heard, only seen when needed, invisible when not. The other guests sipped their wine, their eyes darting away, unwilling to challenge the balance of power. Their silence was permission. Their silence was complicity. And so the man's laughter grew louder, bolder, filling every space where compassion should have lived. Yet, hidden within that silence was something else. Something no one noticed. Someone had been listening. Not just hearing the words, but truly listening. Someone important. Someone whose attention did not fall easily, and whose judgment weighed heavier than gold watches and polished marble. From the far end of the room, their eyes had followed every second, their ears catching the Latin that had slipped past the waitress's lips. Unlike the others, this person had not laughed. They had not looked away. They had not joined in the silence of approval. They simply listened. And in their quiet, there was power waiting to move. But in that moment, the waitress did not know it. To her, All she felt was the laughter ringing in her ears, echoing inside her chest. She turned her face slightly, enough to break eye contact with the man, enough to save herself from revealing the storm inside her. She poured the wine he had demanded, her hand steady despite the tremor in her body. He smirked again, satisfied, sipping his glass as though nothing had happened, as though he had proven a point only he understood. The moment hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. The waitress stepped back, carrying her silence like a shield. But deep inside, beneath the uniform, beneath the weight of humiliation, something else stirred. It was not anger, though anger would have been easy. It was not shame, though shame was what he intended. What stirred inside her was resolve. Quiet, steady, unshaken resolve. For though the room believed the scene was over, the story was only beginning. The laughter may have echoed against the marble walls, but so had her words. And words, once spoken, do not disappear. They linger. They wait. And sometimes, they awaken ears that matter. That was the night's opening act. A laugh meant to humiliate. A silence meant to bury. But what no one realized was that someone who could change everything, had been listening. The night dragged on, and every step she took across that polished floor seemed heavier than the last. The laughter had faded, but its shadow still clung to her like smoke after a fire. Each time she passed his table, she could feel his eyes following her, the smirk tugging at the corner of his lips, daring her to meet his gaze. She didn't. Not because she was afraid, but because she refused to give him the satisfaction of knowing how deeply his mockery had cut. The restaurant's orchestra played softly in the corner, violins weaving through the air like threads of silk. Yet for her, the music could not drown the sting of his voice. When she poured his wine again, he leaned in, speaking low, but just loud enough for her to hear. "Stick to serving food," he muttered, his words sharp as glass. "Languages are for scholars, not waitresses." The insult landed harder than the laughter. His tone carried the weight of a man convinced of his own superiority, a man who saw the world in categories, those who served and those who were served. To him, she had overstepped. Latin did not belong in her mouth. Knowledge, culture, history, these were treasures reserved for men like him, not women in uniforms carrying trays. She stood steady, her face unreadable. Years of work had taught her how to hide the storm inside. The mask of professionalism was her armor, and she wore it now, even as his words sank deep. She moved away from his table, her steps graceful, but in her chest, her heart beat heavy with a familiar ache. This was not the first time. No, she had been here before. In classrooms where her hand was ignored, in interviews where her accent was questioned, in casual conversations where her intelligence was met with surprise. She had long since learned that the world carried assumptions about her, about people who looked like her, about women who worked in roles like hers. To many, she was invisible until she made a mistake. To many, she was unworthy until proven otherwise. But she had also learned something else. Silence was not weakness. Silence was power waiting for its moment. She carried plates to another table, her hands steady, her eyes soft. She smiled at the guests, her voice warm as she offered them dessert options. To them, she was just the waitress again, nothing more, nothing less. But beneath the uniform, behind the polite smile, burned a truth no insult could erase. She was not simply a server. She was a student of words, a lover of history, a woman who had carved out time between 12-hour shifts to study the languages most had forgotten. Latin was not her trick. It was her triumph. And while the rich man smirked at his own cruelty, there was someone else, someone he had not noticed, who watched her closely. At a quiet table near the back of the room sat a figure whose presence was not loud, but undeniable. He was older, his hair silver at the temples, his suit modest but finely cut. He was no stranger to wealth, but unlike the man in the center, he carried no arrogance in his posture. His eyes, sharp yet gentle, had followed the exchange earlier. He had heard the Latin, caught the cadence of her words, recognized their meaning. While others had laughed, he had remained still, listening. Now, as she moved across the floor, his gaze lingered not with ridicule, but with curiosity. He had spent a lifetime studying the languages of the past, funding libraries, restoring manuscripts, championing education. And here, in a restaurant where knowledge was treated like a trophy, he had just witnessed something remarkable, a hidden flame flickering in a place where no one expected it. But for now, he stayed quiet. He wanted to see more. He wanted to watch how she carried herself, how she weathered the storm of humiliation. Sometimes character is revealed not in moments of triumph, but in moments of trial. And tonight, she was being tested. The rich man, unaware of the eyes that followed him, leaned back again, basking in the comfort of his own cruelty. He chuckled with his companions, retelling the moment as though it were a joke worth repeating. "Imagine," he said, his voice dripping with mockery, "a waitress reciting Latin. What next? The janitor quoting Plato." His friends laughed nervously, though their laughter lacked conviction. It was the kind of laughter that belonged to men afraid of losing favor. She passed his table once more, refilling his glass. He looked at her, daring her to speak again. She didn't. Not a word. Only the quiet dignity of a woman who refused to give him the reaction he craved. But inside, something tightened. His words had reminded her of the line she walked every day, the line between invisibility and ridicule. And yet, she also knew that knowledge had a way of revealing itself at the right moment. She thought of the nights spent hunched over worn-out books, the hours scribbling translations by the dim light of a second-hand lamp. She thought of the professors who had doubted her, the classmates who had dismissed her, the customers who never imagined that behind her simple "good evening" lived a mind hungry for more. Every insult she had endured had only fueled her discipline. Every dismissal had sharpened her resolve. And tonight, though he had tried to humiliate her, he had also revealed something to the room. She was not just a waitress. She was something more. Still, the weight of his laughter pressed against her chest. The silence of the room replayed in her mind. The way no one had stood up for her, the way the air had turned cold with complicity. That silence hurt more than his words. It was a reminder that injustice thrives not because of cruelty alone, but because of the quiet approval of those who look away. Yet she did not crumble. She moved through the night with grace, her steps as steady as the ticking of the clock above the bar. She served dishes, refilled glasses, smiled when needed. To the casual eye, nothing had changed. But in truth, everything had. A seed had been planted. A shift was in motion. Because somewhere in the back of the room, a man had been listening. And soon, the balance of power in that restaurant would change. The rich man thought the night belonged to him. He had no idea that his laughter was about to become the very stage for his downfall. The laughter had faded into the background, blending with the clink of silverware and the soft hum of the orchestra. But the tension lingered, hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. The waitress carried on with her duties, her face calm, her steps measured, yet inside she still felt the weight of humiliation pressing against her chest. The rich man at the center table reclined in his chair, confident that the night was his stage. He had humiliated her, and in his mind, that was victory enough. But just as he raised his glass again, something shifted in the room. A hand rose slowly from the far end of the restaurant. The gesture was small, almost modest, but it carried authority that demanded attention. The murmurs died down, the music softened, and all eyes turned toward the man standing near the back. He was not flashy. No gold watch gleamed from his wrist. No entourage sat beside him to amplify his presence. And yet, the moment he stood, the atmosphere changed. His suit was dark and unassuming, but his posture spoke of confidence earned, not borrowed. His eyes, clear and steady, cut across the room until they found the waitress. "Young lady," he said, his voice deep and calm, carrying with the ease of someone accustomed to being heard, "would you repeat what you said earlier?" In Latin. The room froze. Forks were set down mid-bite. Wine glasses paused in mid-air. The rich man shifted in his chair, confused, uncertain. This was not the reaction he had expected. He had wanted the laughter to continue, to keep her small, to keep himself towering above her. But now, someone had interrupted the script. The waitress blinked, caught off guard. Her heart raced, her throat tightened. She could feel dozens of eyes pressing down on her, weighing her with expectation. For a moment, she considered staying silent, retreating back into invisibility. But the man's gaze was steady, kind yet firm, urging her forward. She drew in a breath. Slowly, carefully, she let the words flow again. This time her voice was stronger, steadier, no longer whispered beneath her breath. She recited a line from Cicero, each syllable precise, each word carrying centuries of wisdom. Gratitude is not only the greatest of virtues, but the parent of all the others. The room was silent. Silent in the way a church is silent before prayer. Silent in the way a courtroom is silent before the verdict. The words lingered in the air, sinking into every ear, cutting through the arrogance, the pretense, the shallow laughter. The man at the back smiled faintly, his eyes glimmering with recognition. He nodded, as though confirming something only he understood. Then he turned, slowly, to face the rich man. "And you laughed?" he asked. His voice was not raised, yet it carried with a weight that made the rich man flinch. The power in the room shifted instantly. Where once the rich man's mockery had commanded the stage, now he sat small, exposed. His smirk faltered. His confidence wavered. For the first time that night, he was not the one in control. The waitress stood frozen, still holding her tray, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected anyone to stand up, let alone someone with such presence, someone whose voice alone could silence a room. The older man stepped forward, his words deliberate, his tone sharp but not cruel. "Few people today can speak Latin with such purity," he said. "It takes discipline. It takes dedication. It takes respect." He turned his eyes back to her, nodding once, acknowledging her not as a waitress but as a peer, as someone worthy of respect. The guests shifted in their seats, uncomfortable, realizing they had been witnesses to something shameful. Some looked at their plates. Others glanced nervously at the rich man, whose face was beginning to redden under the scrutiny. The rich man tried to laugh it off, but the sound caught in his throat, hollow and strained. He muttered something about a parlor trick, but his words rang weak. No one echoed his laughter this time. No one joined his dismissal. The balance of power had slipped through his fingers, and he could feel it. The older man took another step closer, his gaze never wavering. "And yet," he said, his voice tightening, "you mocked her." He let the silence stretch, heavy and condemning. The rich man shifted again, tugging at his collar, avoiding the eyes that now stared at him not with admiration, but with quiet judgment. The waitress felt a warmth spread through her chest, a mix of relief and disbelief. For once, someone had not only heard her but defended her. For once, the humiliation she had been forced to swallow had not gone unanswered. But the moment was not just about her. It was about the entire room. Every guest had witnessed the shift. Every guest had seen dignity rise from the ashes of mockery. And every guest now understood who truly held power in this room. It wasn't the man with the gold watch and the loud laugh. It was the woman who had spoken ancient words with grace. It was the man who had chosen to listen. The orchestra had gone silent, the waiters had paused mid-step, the room itself seemed to hold its breath. The turning point had come. And from here, nothing would be the same. The rich man sat in his chair, small and shrinking, while the waitress stood taller than she had all evening, her dignity shining through the cracks of humiliation. The older man gave her another nod, as if to say, "Hold your head high. This moment belongs to you now." And as the night pressed on, everyone knew they had just witnessed the beginning of a reversal, a story that would not end the way it had begun. The restaurant was silent in a way it had never been before. It wasn't the silence of indifference, nor the silence of routine. It was heavier. It carried weight. The rich man sat slouched in his chair, shrinking beneath the eyes of those who had once admired him. His gold watch no longer gleamed with confidence. It looked cheap under the weight of shame. His smirk had vanished. The arrogance that had once filled the room like smoke had been blown away in a single breath of truth. The older man, the scholar whose voice had pierced the tension, stepped forward again. He was close enough now that the waitress could see the kindness in his eyes, a kindness that cut through the intimidation of the moment. He didn't look at her as a servant. He didn't look at her as someone beneath him. He looked at her as an equal, someone who carried dignity not because of wealth or status, but because of who she was. "Few people," he said softly, his voice warm but carrying enough strength for all to hear, "can recite Latin with such fluency. It is a language that requires discipline, patience, and respect. It is not the language of mockery. It is the language of history. It is the language of wisdom. He paused, letting the words settle into the quiet. Then his gaze shifted to the rich man. "And yet," he continued, "you chose to laugh. You chose to belittle. Not because she was wrong, but because you assumed she had no right to speak it." His words struck harder than any shout could have. They exposed the cruelty for what it was. Not wit, not humor, but arrogance. The rich man's lips parted, searching for an excuse, a defense, anything to rebuild the wall of superiority that had crumbled around him. But no words came. The silence was louder than anything he could say. His glass trembled slightly in his hand as he set it down, trying to avoid the eyes that no longer admired him. The waitress stood motionless, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent so long being invisible, so long swallowing the sting of insults, that this moment felt unreal. To be defended, to be seen, to be acknowledged. It was something she had dreamed of but never expected to happen in a place like this. The scholar turned back to her, his expression softening. "You carry something rare," he said. "A hunger for knowledge. A discipline that cannot be bought." He reached into his coat and drew out a small card, placing it gently on her tray. "I run a foundation," he explained. "We sponsor students who show promise in classical studies. I would be honored if you considered applying." Her breath caught in her throat. She stared at the card as if it were glowing, her hands trembling as she held it. Around her, the other guests whispered in awe. Some were ashamed of their silence earlier. Others were struck by the beauty of the reversal, the way dignity had risen from mockery. But no one felt the weight of the moment more than the rich man. His face was pale, his arrogance shattered. He had tried to make her small, and instead, he had revealed his own emptiness. He looked down at the table, suddenly fascinated by the shine of his fork, desperate to avoid the eyes now judging him. The waitress straightened her posture, the uniform she once wore like a chain now feeling almost like armor. She smiled faintly, her eyes glistening with gratitude, but she said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence spoke louder than any words could. It was the silence of someone who had endured, the silence of someone whose dignity had survived the fire. The scholar turned back to the room, his voice carrying like a sermon. "Respect," he said, "is not measured by wealth. It is not measured by status. It is measured by how you treat those you believe cannot answer back." And tonight, we have all been reminded that true worth cannot be mocked away. True dignity cannot be silenced. The word struck the guests deeply. Some lowered their heads in shame, realizing they had laughed or looked away when cruelty unfolded before them. Others felt inspired, seeing how quickly the balance of power could shift when truth was spoken. The orchestra, sensing the shift, began to play again. The notes were soft, almost reverent, filling the silence with music that seemed to bless the moment. The waitress tucked the card close to her heart, her mind racing with possibilities she had never allowed herself to imagine. Perhaps this was the door she had been waiting for. Perhaps all those nights of study, all those hours of stolen time with old books and fading pages, had not been in vain. As the night drew on, the restaurant returned to its rhythm, but nothing was the same. Guests looked at her differently now, not with pity or dismissal, but with respect. The rich man left early, his steps quick, his head low. He had entered the restaurant as the loudest voice in the room, but he left in silence, stripped of the false power he had wielded so carelessly. And the waitress? She stayed. She continued her work, carrying trays, pouring wine, serving dishes. But inside something had changed. She no longer carried the weight of humiliation. She carried possibility. She carried dignity. She carried the knowledge that no amount of laughter could erase her worth. The scholar watched her one last time before he left, nodding as if to say, "Your story is not finished. This is only the beginning." And so, the night ended not with the sound of cruel laughter, but with silence. The kind of silence that lingers after truth has been spoken. The kind of silence that transforms. The kind of silence that teaches. Because the lesson was clear. Wealth without respect is emptiness. Power without humility is weakness. And dignity, once revealed, cannot be taken away. That night in a velvet and marble restaurant, a rich man tried to make a waitress small. Instead, he became smaller than he had ever imagined, and she rose taller than she had ever known. And the world was reminded of a truth too often forgotten. Greatness is not in what you own, but in who you are when no one expects you to shine.